3,000 years ago, the Bible tells us that the tribes of Israel had not yet become the people of Israel. Every tribe had its own leadership. Every tribe had its own internal policy and foreign policy. And we had lots of enemies surrounding us who liked that very much. It meant that each of the tribes, if it was Judah, if it was Reuben, if it was Simon, it didn't matter which, was facing enemies alone, which meant that our enemies could pick us off one by one. If you go back to the biblical record in the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, you see this constant struggle of the tribes of Israel against their enemies. And one of the biggest enemies that we will have here over 3,000 years ago is the Philistines, the Greek-speaking sea peoples who are off to the west, who settle and conquer the coastal plain area and continuously push their way into the Judean or the Israelite heartland, but in this part of the country it's the Judean heartland. These are the days before there is a king in Israel, before there is a king to unite the people. So the tribes of Israel over 3,000 years ago, their leaders go to the prophet Samuel, who lived in the area just north of Jerusalem, and they say to Shmuel, the prophet, Samuel the prophet, Samuel, we need a king. We need a king to unite us, to fight against our enemies. And Samuel doesn't really want them to have a king. He knows it's not such a good idea. And he says, look, a king is going to raise your taxes. You're not going to be happy with what the king does. And besides, he says, you already have a king. Who is that king? God in heaven. But God sometimes knows a little better. And he says to the prophet Samuel, they want a king. Let them have a king. And that first king is going to be Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. Shaul of Binyamin is going to be the first king. And one of his first orders of business is to defend the Judean heartland, the Judean hills and the villages and towns against the Philistines coming from the coastal plain with their chariots, with their iron swords and shields, whereas if we read the biblical text correctly, the Israelites only have bronze swords and shields. It's a tough battle. And one of the greatest battles recorded in the Bible between the Israelites and the Philistines under the leadership of King Saul happens here right at the foot of Azeka. One of the really nice things here at Tel Azeka Park of today is that, well, we bring our Bibles with us, our Tanakh with us, but they've also put a lot of the relevant biblical verses on the stonework here as we walk up so we can read it. And it sets the stage for us of the story of David and Goliath and Saul that happens here at Azeka. And this is from the book of Judges, chapter 14. At that time, the Philistines rule over Israel. And we continue up the path, and we're going to get to our second verse. The second verse that we get to, we get to our second verse here, which really sets the tone, sets the stage of what's happening here. The book of Samuel, in chapter 13, Samuel 1, is telling us there's no metalworking. The Philistines who rule Israel do not allow any metalworking to go on because they're afraid that perhaps the Ivrim, the Hebrews, will make swords or spears. So you can see how the Philistines are trying to keep their monopoly on metalworking. We think this is also an issue. They're keeping a monopoly on iron, which they're already using, whereas the Israelites are using more the bronze. In the book of Samuel 1, chapter 17 and 18, we get the story of how Saul is going to confront King Saul, the new king of Israel, trying to unite all the tribes of Israel, to push back the Philistine threat. Now, the Philistines are on the western side of the land of Israel, on the Mediterranean coast, and they're pushing eastward into the mountain area, the heartland of the tribe of Judah. And we're told, the first verse of chapter 17 in Samuel 1, and the Philistines assembled their forces for battle. They massed at Socho of Judah, which is down in the valley beneath us here, and encamped at Ephes Damim between Socho and Azeka. We're standing here on Azeka, so we're told, the text is telling us they're down in the valley, probably down where we see the hothouses right now. Why do I say that? Because the verses continue. Because Saul and the men of Israel massed and encamped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up their line of battle against the Philistines stationed on one hill and Israel stationed on the opposite hill, and the valley was between them. So we can see here, the Philistines are here at the foot of Azeka, The valley of Elah is down beneath us, and the Israelites under Judah would either have been at the first ridge here, but most likely the second ridge, which is near Sopho, which is described in the biblical text. And now, the book of Samuel, the Bible is describing for us the army of Saul and the men of Israel. And it's very clear from the description. This is not a standing army. These are the farmers and shepherds of the tribes of Israel. And in this part of the country, we're in the Judean area, so this is the tribe of Judah. These are the farmers and shepherds of the tribe of Judah, and they will come and join with the king when he says we need to gather together for battle, drafted, if you will, for a little while. When the battle's over, they go back home. And we're told in the biblical account that David, who was the youngest of 7 or 8 brothers, his older brothers go off to war, leaving David at home to watch over the flocks. Now, where is home for David? David lives in Bethlehem, up in the Judean hills, which is just here to our east. And we're in the valley just beneath the Judean hills. And at a certain point, we also get some insight here from the biblical text about how the army worked. David's father, Jesse, Ishai in Hebrew, says to David, listen, your brothers are at the front with King Saul fighting against the Philistines. You need to send them food. Apparently there wasn't a central commissary. You had to send them food. And he sends David down with food and supplies to his brothers. He also makes sure to send with David gifts for the officers, for his brother's officers. Again, gives us some insight how this army works. It's a very makeshift kind of army. Well, we're told David comes down from the hill, and we can actually see the mountain pass that he would have come down from. And as he's coming down, he has a bird's eye view of this. He can see the Philistine camp over here on the west, and he can see the Israelite camp on the east. And as he's coming down, the biblical text does it for us so dramatically. He sees striding out from the Philistine camp towards the Israelites led by King Saul, a very large man. Now, he wasn't the jolly green giant like we imagined sometimes when we were kids, 35 feet tall. If you put the numbers together, it seems to be about 8 feet tall, something like that, 7 foot something, be a good basketball player, big guy, might have had a medical condition that accounts for it, but he's wearing big boots made of iron, he's wearing armor, he's got a big helmet on top of his head, he's got a spear that comes up from behind him, he might even have a 3-sided shield with a shield bearer in front of him. The man looks ginormous. I mean, he's huge. And little David, who's the youngest of his family, and we're told he's a little bit of a runt. He becomes very good looking later, but he's described earlier on as a kind of small guy, is coming down, and he sees this Philistine, who's described, by the way, as the uncircumcised ones, the Philistines, marching out towards King Saul and the men of Israel, where David's older brothers are, in the army camp. And he can hear him issue his challenge. Men of Israel, are you all cowards? Where is your champion to come fight against me? We don't all have to die in battle. Just send a champion against me. If I win, you put down your arms and you become slaves to the Philistines. If you win, unlikely, or if your guy wins, then we'll put down our swords and become slaves to the Israelites. Now, David coming down from Bethlehem to the army of Israel, he sees King Saul, he hears this Goliath, and then Goliath goes on, he insults Saul, he insults the men of Israel, and he insults the God of Israel. He says, you're a bunch of cowards. And the Bible tells us that Saul and their men are shaking in their boots, essentially. They are scared. But so David is asking, as he comes into the military camp of Israel, the other side of the valley here, after he's heard Goliath, the Philistine, insult the God of Israel, the King of Israel, the men of Israel, and no response from the men of Israel. He's terribly upset. He hears as a reward if anybody's willing to kill this Goliath of the Philistines, and he starts asking around, what's the reward? And remember, he's a young guy, he's not a warrior, he's a shepherd, and he's a kid. His oldest brother, Eliab, hears about that. He's asking, what's the reward? He takes him aside and he gives him a real good talking to. He's not happy with him at all. But in any event, eventually word gets to King Saul that there's somebody in the camp who's willing to face Goliath, the Philistine. And Saul has offered a reward, among other things, marrying his daughter, Michal, marrying the princess, which makes him, and part of the royal family. It's a pretty cool thing. So he hears that there's someone who's willing to. Remember, the Bible tells us the men of Israel are essentially shaking in their boots. They're terrified. And he says, bring that person to me. And they bring in David. He's a kid. He's a shepherd. And Saul says, oh, come on. You can't go face this Goliath. He's a warrior, and you're a shepherd. And David says, listen. He says, listen, I'm a shepherd. It's true. I'm a boy. But with the help of God, with the help of the God of Israel, who has been insulted and desecrated by this Philistine, I can do it. How do I know this? Because when I'm out in the fields with my flocks and I'm attacked by a bear, I know how to stop the bear. I know how to stop the lions that come after the flocks, and God will give me the strength to also stop the Philistine. There wasn't much that Saul can say to that. First of all, he didn't have many options. No one else was willing to go, and he's resorted to God. Right? He says, "God will do it." Okay, maybe God will. So Saul says, "But look, at least let me give you my armor and my sword." So they put Saul's armor on David. The biblical text tells us, give him the sword, and David can barely move. I mean, he's wearing the armor. He says, "Listen," he says, "this is not for me." He goes with his shepherd's stick, with his slingshot that he uses to get to fight off the bears and the lions that would come after his shepherds. And he starts across the field towards the riverbed, where you can see the road today. Down there is more or less where the riverbed would have been. Starts towards the Philistine camp, and this big warrior Goliath was standing there in front, calling out insults to the God of Israel and the people of Israel. And we're told in the biblical text, David bends down at one point. He picks up some stones at the edge of the river as he keeps going towards Goliath. Now Goliath sees him. You can imagine the big warrior, tall man, armor. He sees a little shepherd boy coming towards him with a staff, with a little slingshot, and he laughs at him. He laughs at him, and he says, "I'm going to take you apart." He says, "I'm going to skin you and leave you to the beasts of the field." David will answer him and basically saying this, "Oh yeah?" He says, "I'm going to do that to you, but I'm going to do it with the God of Israel. It's the God of Israel who you have insulted, if you have desecrated, he will give me victory over you." And at one point, Goliath will say to him, "What am I, a dog? You're coming at me with this staff of a shepherd. Am I a dog that you're going to shoo me away?" And David just keeps going. He has this faith, and remember, he's picked up the stones already. He's working on his slingshot, and from what we understand of the armor of the Philistines, there's a helmet, there's a visor that could probably come over the face. Could be that Goliath was so confident here, right? What's this little guy going to do to me? There's a little strip that was visible, and David's stone hits him right in the head. He's stunned. He falls to the ground. David, the Bible has told us a few times by this point, David took no sword. Remember, he's not going to take Saul's sword. It's too big for him. All he has is his staff, his slingshot, and his faith in God. And he runs forward to the stunned Goliath, takes Goliath's sword, cuts off Goliath's head, and imagine he's down here. The Philistine army is right over here. The Israelite army on the other side of the valley. He holds up Goliath's head. Now remember the deal that Goliath had proposed. What's supposed to happen? If the Israelite champion beats the Philistine champion, Goliath, then the Philistines are supposed to put their arms down and surrender to Israel. But that's not what happens. The Philistines run like hell, and they're going to run through the valley here. We're told they actually go to the Sha'araim road, which we think we've identified off to the right, to the east from here, and they flee back towards the Philistine areas, and David has saved the day for Saul, the first king of Israel, for the men of Israel and of Judah who are trying to block the Philistines from the mountain pass from coming in there into the Judean heartland, and they run back. The Israelites will chase the Philistines for a little bit, then Saul pulls them back. He doesn't want to go too far, but this will be the first public step of David as a champion and fighter of Israel, which will eventually propel him to become the next king of Israel from the tribe of Judah, and he will succeed in uniting the tribes of Israel, where ultimately Saul fails.